It is smokescreen season for the NFL draft, but we do not care here on Locked On Dolphins. Chris Grier met with the media, and I'm reacting to some of the things he had to say here today on Locked On Dolphins.
You are Locked On Dolphins, your daily Miami Dolphins podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, Miami. Welcome to another episode of Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day here on the Locked On Network. I'm your host, Kyle Krabs, a lifelong Miami Dolphins fan, host of Locked On Dolphins, co-host of Locked On NFL Scouting. You can find our shows on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. Tip of the cap to our everydayers because it is your team every day here on the Locked On Network. We do not just say it, we live it. Today's episode of Locked On Dolphins is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code Locked On NFL for $20 off your first purchase on last-minute tickets. Lowest prices guaranteed. Let's get some admin stuff right out of the way. It's smokescreen season. It's Tuesday, April 16th, 2024. GMs lie all the time. They're going to tell you out in the open what they want you to hear to manipulate the events of the NFL draft as much as they possibly can to get the most favorable outcome for them. I understand that. I also don't care. Chris Grier spoke with the media. I thought he had some really interesting things to say, whether they're factual statements or not. Some of them are draft ideology. Some of them he came straight out and said, we have no reason to lie to you. Yes, the intent is to exercise the fifth-year options for both Jalen Waddle and Jalen Phillips, which is a big-time dub for the Dolphins. Ideally, you get long-term contract extensions with both of those players done before they have to play on their fifth-year options. But nevertheless, these are good players that the Dolphins have drafted. You take advantage of the fifth-year option, reduced value for the fifth year of the deal. You could sign a contract extension with either one and, in theory, have it added to the back end after the fifth-year option takes place. That's what the Philadelphia Eagles did with Devonta Smith and his contract as well. So lots of different ways that you can go about utilizing the fifth year as a tool beyond just you're going to play on it and then leave, like what happened with Christian Wilkins. Okay, so he said, no reason to lie to you. Yes, the intent is to pick up both of those fifth-year options, which is a good thing. They talked about the Tua Tagovailoa contract extension. That's not really where we're going to have our focus now, which is also what it sounds like for Miami continuing ongoing negotiations with Tua and his team of representation. But the focus right now within the football operations is in the draft. And we had some good questions that were asked in the presser today that I thought gave some really insightful observations and answers from Chris Grier as far as how this team operates, what this team does, why this team approaches the draft the way that it does. And Chris Grier was asked, I believe, by Marcel Louis-Jacques from ESPN about what the timeline and process looks like for trading up or down in the draft. And Chris Grier had his own answers there that we will share here and now and give you my reaction on Locked On Dolphins.
Yeah, some of those conversations are happening now, where teams call and say, hey, would you be willing to move down or move up? So for the most part, if a deal is too good to pass up, you pull the trigger now because you never know what those opportunities come and go. But usually most of them are draft day. Because people want to see if the players they're interested are still there. If someone has specifically targeted, one or two players, and again, it also could go at the depth of that position. There may be two players at a position they like in the first round, one's gone, and so a team wants to come up and get them. So, so for the most part, to your question, it's draft day. But we've had discussions with teams about moving up and down, them calling us, and so it's been the typical draft week.
So. A couple interesting things here. Obviously, Miami, not surprised that they are holding these conversations now for a team that 2 years ago traded out of 3 back to 12. 3 years ago traded from 3 to 12 and back to 6 all in one fell swoop. That happened in March. But up and down in point of the conversation here, I think it is much more feasible that Miami were to be moving down than it is to move up. And part of that is why is based off of the next thing that Chris shared that we'll talk about here in just a moment as far as how the Dolphins board looks. But I thought the scenario that he provided second, talking about the depth of a position, is a particularly interesting one and a dangerous way to play the game. right? Because that feels like it's what happened to the Dolphins with the Liam Eichenberg selection back in 2021. If you remember, the Dolphins had the 50th pick. They come through, they make their draft choice of Javon Holland. The Tevin Jenkins pick comes in. There's a little mini pseudo run on offensive linemen in that early portion of the second round. And then Miami does the trade up with the New York Giants to draft Liam Eichenberg. And that felt like it was the last player that they had graded in a certain stratosphere of players, right or wrong, to go up where they had. Miami picked at 36. Landon Dickerson comes off the board at 37. And then Tevin Jenkins comes off the board at 39. The Dolphins then 2 picks later traded up to 42 to draft Eichenberg in that spot. So that is a real-life embodiment of that approach. In Miami, in a perfect world, if you're entertaining trading down out of 21, you would have somebody else that is approaching their draft selection process in that school of thought. But that is a little bit more of a dangerous way to play the game because you're now pooling multiple assets into a singular pick, which Miami, of course, took pick 50 and a future 3 to go up 8 spots and land presumably what they felt was the last offensive lineman within a specific tier of players that they were interested in pursuing. So I thought it was neat to hear Chris refer to that specific kind of scenario. He's obviously not specifically referring to that individual transaction or series of domino events in an actual draft, but that was the first thing that came to my mind as far as, I've seen Miami approach it that way. And it's less about being right or wrong with the decision, because I think Miami, ultimately you'd love to have nailed one of the other players down. Or you could have drafted Creed Humphrey, right, as a center. But it's hard to say what their original plan was in 2021 for Liam. Was it to be at tackle? He was originally a tackle when he first came to the team. And the tackles that kind of came after that were Walker Little and Jackson Carman and Sam Cosmi. And, you don't really love any of those players either. Jalen Mayfield, who's been a catastrophic player. So if they evaluated him as a tackle, they were right to put their chips in that basket. But the evaluation of him being a tackle was the incorrect element of that series of events. But hearing Chris talk about moving up or down, those conversations happening now, if you get a sweetheart offer, you take it. I think that's particularly interesting as well. But the vast majority of them do indeed happen on draft night, especially this close to the draft, and Miami not picking at or near the top where there's shuffling that's going to be happening in anticipation of securing a quarterback. So thought that was good ideological insight as far as the process of trading up or down and what it looks like. But how is it facilitated? That is next, our next focus here on this episode of Locked On Dolphins. So stick with us. Today's episode of Locked On Dolphins is sponsored by BetterHelp. Sometimes we all need the opportunity to get something off of our chest. Big or small, certain things in life can really start to get to you. It's important for you to let those things out, especially to someone who is unbiased in your life. Therapy can be different for everyone. Give it a try. BetterHelp is designed to be super easy, convenient, flexible, suited to your schedule, entirely online. You can visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOn for 10% off your first month. That is BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOn. Chris was asked about how they're expecting the board to fall to them. And this is where I think it is important to acknowledge that it is smokescreen season, right? He said, we do feel and anticipate that we will have 1 to 2 players that we really like, that we think could be impact starters for us at pick number 21 with how the board is expected to fall. That is noteworthy, but not really something I put a lot of value in, because if Miami's already having conversations about going up or down the board, you don't want it to be known that you're boxed into a corner and you feel like you're picking at a spot. You don't feel like you're having commensurative value for the pick that you're picking. Because if that were the case, a team that wants you to trade up with them would say, well, we know you don't like any of your players. We know you're desperate to get out. It's going to cost you more because we know what your positioning is relative to your board. You want to get a player that's worth your pick. So come get one. And if you're trying to go down, a team would say, well, we know you're out of players that you feel like are worth that pick. So why should we pay a premium price to help you out when we know that the board has dried up already versus players that you feel are appropriate value for pick number 21? That wasn't the interesting part. The interesting part was when Chris Grier was asked specifically about the Dolphins draft board and the number of first-round picks that the team had currently on the board. Take a look.
I think we feel there'll be, we definitely feel there will be one or two players that we really like there, is where we are right now. We feel that we can get an impact player there that will help our team and roster, and we'd be very excited to add. So we've gone through it a few times. We'll keep going through it here, but we feel good about who would be there at 21 if we were to pick there.
So it's fair to say you have at least 21 first-round grades. Is that
no, it's because you're asking that question because all that story when guys ask how many first, but no. As of right now, we do not have 21 first-round grades, but we feel that, again, when teams are building for their roster, teams are looking at different things. So you talk to every team, and they're usually in that 15 to 20 range on players, and but it varies from team to team what everyone's looking for. So
15 to 20 first-round grades, the norm. And for whatever reason, you get to April, and in the draft world, in the draft realm, as a longtime draft Nick, this debate pops up every single year where an analyst will share the amount of first-round grades that they have, and somebody just can't help themselves. They'll chime in and be like, that's ridiculous. There's 32 first-round picks. How do you not have 32 first-round grades? But there's a difference between being a top 32 player, which would mean we feel you are going to go in the first round, versus are you actually worth in isolation, you as an individual player? Are you worth the top 10 pick? Are you worth a first round pick with your resume as it pertains to us and our grading criteria? So it's kind of neat to hear Chris say the quiet part out loud as far as when you are a draftnik, like that debate comes up for whatever reason every single year. But I've talked a lot as I've been grading these offensive linemen and wide receivers, and the past 2 days on the show, we've revealed final positional rankings for those two positions graded specifically against the Dolphins offense. And that's why the field is maybe a little bit more narrow than what it currently is. Case in point, I have 15 first-round grades on my board while grading for the Dolphins from their offensive and defensive schemes. If you caught the show in which we went over the do not trade away from list, those players are largely the first-round grades that I have assigned. That doesn't include one quarterback that I gave a first-round grade to, which was Caleb Williams, and one linebacker with an injury history in Peyton Wilson, who got a first-round grade for me. But I'll quickly read through the names. The top 15 names that I have graded are definitive first-round grades. I have some late one, early twos, which is a whole other subsection of like last few picks of the first round, first 10 picks of the second round. And that would hypothetically be if you're going to trade down from 21 because your board is empty, that would be the range you're looking to get into to then pick from the talent that's available in that bucket because it's appropriate value for where you are picking. But just authentic first-round grades. Joe Alt, Marvin Harrison Jr., Troy Fatanu, Byron Murphy, Malik Neighbors, Quinyon Mitchell, Jared Verse, Roma Dunze, Johnny Newton, Leatu, Caleb Williams, Cooper DeJean, Brock Bowers, Dallas Turner, and Peyton Wilson are the top 15 players that I have graded in this draft class for Miami. And those would be the guys that I would have first-round, definitive, stone-cold lock first-round grades on. I have others like Talise Fuaga, Olufashanu, J.C. Latham, Terrion Arnold, Graham Barton, Darius Robinson, Ricky Pearsall that I have late one, early twos on, and there's more than that. But that's just to fill out the names for you guys, to give you guys an idea of who's like at 21, you feel like you're getting appropriate value versus, hey, maybe we kick down the board a little bit because that well is empty. And for Chris to say we do not have 21 first-round grades, it at least does open up the possibility, depending on how close it is to 21 and how many quarterbacks go. Like if they have 15 guys and there's 4 quarterbacks that go and all 15 other guys go, you could live in a world where Dolphins get on the board and say, we don't have a first-round value on our board. Let's get out of here. Equally, possible is there's other players that the Dolphins don't really care about the criteria as much as that make them the players that they are that come off the board before, and the Dolphins get on the board, and there's 5 of their first round grades are still left. They could stay and pick, or in theory, they could trade down. We've gone over that theory when going over the list of the guys that I personally would not trade away from. But just a further reinforcement of that is it's coming from the Dolphins general manager. This is where we stand. This is where most teams stand as far as grading for different criteria. It gives you different outcomes in different boards. And most teams fall between this arbitrary range of 15 to 20 players that they would individually classify as first round picks. And the Dolphins are in that boat to some degree because he said we do not have 21 first round grades. What that ultimately means, I have no reason to believe that that is a smokescreen. I think that's an authentic answer. Because again, if everybody's criteria is different, whether we do or don't have 21 first round grades is inconsequential because our criteria is different than yours. So we have the players different, and it is going to nudge teams to be motivated to go up or down the board or stay and pick. Now, Chris Grier also talked about best player available kind of being the school of thought that they try to approach early in the draft as compared to drafting for needs. He was drafted about the edge guys with their rehab. He was asked about replacing Christian Wilkins. Pretty emphatic that best player available. He was then asked about a quarterback. Would you guys draft a quarterback? And he says, we talk about picking best player available, but that's not a position that I would be looking at in the first round. But we do look to add to every position with depth. And he was asked a really good question. I believe it was from Chris Perkins about the application, the best player available ideology. And we're getting into that to bring us to a close here on this episode of Locked on Dolphins. Buying tickets to your favorite sporting events should not be a stressful experience, so don't let it be, and use Game Time. Game Time, now an authorized ticket marketplace for Major League Baseball, makes getting tickets even easier and faster than before. Prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer you get to first pitch with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee. Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying tickets for the MLB or all your other sports, concerts, comedy, theater. You could save up to 60%. And with all-in pricing, you have no surprises when you put the tickets into your cart and go to checkout. You see all fees applied up front. And with the lowest price guarantee from Game Time, they will credit you 110% of the difference if you find cheaper seats in the same section and row. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms to apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL, LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today for last-minute tickets. Lowest prices guaranteed. Chris Grier, I love this question because I'm a nerd for this kind of stuff. Some of you might not be or might not care, but you're here, so I'm, again, operating in the assumption that you do care. So please regard me as I kind of geek out over the application of the best player available theory. Chris is generally pretty close to the vest with his media availabilities. I thought he gave some really authentic, genuine answers here. And this one is going to help me as somebody who works in this space, continuing to understand the how and the why of how teams approach various intersections of the draft. So here's Chris Grier on the application of the best player available theory and how it works and how deep into the draft it works.
Yeah, no, I think the best player available, and again, this is probably going back from years. I said when I started, learned under Coach Parcells years ago, and going through Coach Carroll, Nick Saban and stuff. So you always stack your board and you work hard. So, but your board obviously early in the draft will always look kind of how you set it in terms of best player. But when you get into the day threes, the board's it's being picked apart, flying all over the place. So it's one of those. And I think sometimes when you get late in the draft, you end up looking for depth or to filling holes in your roster. But for the most part, I think most teams would be early in the draft. You're always going to take the best player available for the first couple rounds because that's where you probably have the most control of how your board looks in terms of how you spent all the offseason ranking, in terms of all your time with the coaching staff and scouts to build it.
So this is something that I've lived in real time because as I did it for free agency and I've also done it for the draft, and I did it for the draft last year. It's called a horizontal draft board where across, like reading left to right, is columns, and the columns are positions. There's quarterbacks and running backs and wide receivers and tight ends and offensive tackles and interior offensive line and interior defensive line and edge, linebacker, corner, and safety. That's the whole left to right. But then as you read top to bottom within each individual column, that is the order in which the players are graded. And it's tiered where it's not just reading top down, although you can read it that way to say, here's my first ranked quarterback, my second ranked quarterback, my third ranked quarterback. But because it also reads left to right, if my top ranked wide receiver is a tier above my top ranked quarterback, it will reflect that. And I can just look at the whole image and I can see, wow, there's a lot of names stacked at the very tippy top in this position group, but the first name that's available at this position group is 2 tiers lower. So it doesn't have the same value at the top of the position versus this other position in the draft. And hearing Chris talk about, the first few rounds is where you're kind of in control of how the board and BPA actually looks is a very real thing, because as free agency starts happening, just as an example, I built one of these for free agency, names start signing quickly and players are signing big contracts quickly. And all of a sudden this tippy top, very top heavy position group, it's gone. And now you're looking at that position group, in theory, defensive tackles, where you talk about Chris Jones and Christian Wilkins and just a matter of a week off the board. And you say, wow, this well dried up pretty quick. So best player available no longer in the conversation there, where you would thought maybe coming in, it would be, especially if you're applying it to the draft landscape. But then to hear about how later in the draft you're addressing needs by filling holes and getting more competition to step into roles. Day 3 for me, at least through my personal ideology, had always been very skewed towards special teams and project players. The appeal of a small school developmental offensive lineman or corner that has like the unteachable things, the physical ability, whether it's a long physical corner or it's an athletic offensive lineman. You can't teach somebody to be big and athletic. You can teach them technique. So that for me, through my personal school of thought, it's always been so much more point of emphasis. Go get those kinds of players early on day 3. And then later on day 3, get your high motor, high effort, high IQ, less physically talented players to be your depth players and special teams players, to make sure that you have quality competition on your special teams rosters as well. And then you can let competition play itself out and decide who you want to make sure you're committed to on your 53 throughout the course of that year. So to hear you address your holes on your roster a little bit more by being proactive for where your roster needs attention is certainly a different application that I will be bearing in mind, specifically watching how and where Miami uses that with their day 3 picks in this year's class. So I thought that was a really interesting answer, but can certainly relate to Chris talking about spending time assembling a board, and then you get into the actual trenches, and that board changes and the dynamics of it change very quickly. And you guys will be able to follow along with that, because over on Touchdown Miami, which is where I do my long form written Dolphins content, my Dolphins draft board will be made available there for you guys to download. And you'll see very quickly about the visual representation of value at each position in the draft class, and then see how quickly it changes when names start coming off of that board. And staying true, it can be very easy to find yourself in a very obvious best player available situation when it is that fluid and you have your own individual set of criteria that players are available to you and then very quickly become not available to you, and the runs start happening and you're mindful. And that takes you all the way back to trading up or down for 21. And is there a lot of depth in a position group that you wanted to address? And if not, and you're seeing that group whittle all the way down, you might be proactive to go up and get a guy. And that's the shoes that if Miami wants to trade down and maximize their first round pick and recoup more value back because they're out of first round picks, just to tie all these talking points together, that's the shoes that the Dolphins find somebody in when they're calling Miami about that pick. Or you have one guy left who is indeed, as Chris alluded to, an impact player that you stick and pick. So I love the draft. There's so many different angles to it. There's so many different variables to it. And we are getting closer, about 9 days away from the start of it this year, which I'm very fired up for. You can keep it locked in right here on Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day. I appreciate you guys for checking out the show. Make it a great rest of your day. I'm out of here. Fins up.